Hello everybody. In this video we're going to take a look very quickly at some camera and lighting techniques to help you better present your models. So as you can see, we have this scene here with this teddy bear model, and we'll go ahead and begin. One of the first things that I like to do is actually create a new camera. So if we look in our outliner, you'll see that our scene right now is quite simple. We have 4 cameras: perspective, top, front, and side, and we have the teddy bear mesh. Why don't I just use the perspective camera to render to? Well, because I like to keep the perspective camera as a working camera. That way, when I spend all the time and effort into placing my camera just where I want it, I don't lose all that work because I need to rotate around my model. So to create my own camera, I'll go to Create, Cameras, Camera. And I'm going to call this camera Render Camera. Now to look through this camera, which you'll notice is currently located right here at the origin of our world space, I'm going to go to my 4 panels here, and I can choose any one of these panels that I want to be that view through this camera. I'm going to use this top view here, and to switch it to the render camera, I'll simply go to Panels, Perspective, Render Camera. And now I'm looking through my render camera, and I can place it just like I want for my composition. So here you can see I've got a perspective camera and I've got my render camera, and right now they look very similar. Another thing I like to do before I render is make sure I know where the borders are for my composition, because I can move this window any way I like. This way I really don't know where the borders are for my render. But if I click on this button here, this will show me the borders of my render, which is currently set to 640 by 480. Now, that might not be the resolution I want to render it out at, so I'll go to my render settings, and I'm going to pick a different image size here. For this example, I'm going to use the HD 720. And as you can see, this has changed the format for my render. And now I can really fine-tune and place where my camera will be. I can do this because I know that it's not going to render anything beyond this border here. And remember that we turned this on in here by clicking on this button here. Now, I'm going to be creating lights for this. In fact, I'm going to be creating at least 3 lights for this scene. We'll take a look at what is called the 3-point lighting setup. But if I'm using lights, I'm going to need to have a ground surface to be able to cast shadows. And of course, what I can do is create a polygon plane for that. One thing I don't like about the polygon plane, however, is that it has these borders here. Of course, I can make this plane a lot larger, but what we're going to try to do is create something a little bit more like what you might find in a professional photography studio. Now remember, I'm using this as my render camera, and this is my actual working camera for my perspective view. That way I can change this view without impacting this one. I might, however, accidentally, this happens oftentimes, accidentally move this camera, in which case I'll lose that work that I put into it. So what I might do for this render camera is bookmark the position of it. And to do that, I can simply click on this button here that looks like a ribbon. It is a bookmark. And if I click on that, now, if I move this accidentally, let's say, and I'm like, oh no, I need to move it back to where it was. How am I going to do that? Well, all I need to do is go to View, Bookmarks, and I have my bookmarks set up right here. And if I click on one of my bookmarks, it'll pop it right back to its original position. Okay, so as I mentioned before, we're going to create something a little bit more like a professional photography studio setup. And to do that, I am going to create a polygon cylinder. And we'll rotate it 90 degrees. And perhaps scale it up. And I'm actually going to add some additional divisions to it, just to get it to be maybe a little smoother. And now I'm going to delete some of the faces on it. And here is what I have. However, we're not done yet. One thing I'm going to need to do, I'm going to turn on backface culling here so you can see. As you can see, this is the actual side here. This is not the side of this geometry, so we need to flip those normals. With the mesh selected, I'll go to Mesh Display, Reverse. That will flip the normals of this geometry. And I'm going to do a little bit more modeling to this object. I'm going to select this top edge here, and I will go to my modeling toolkit, click on Extrude, and I'm not going to extrude it in this axis. I'm going to click on this little manipulator here, or rather toggle, so that I'm extruding to the world coordinates. I'll drag it up here, maybe add a few divisions to it. And I'm going to do the same down here. Something like that. To make this a little easier to work with, I think I will move the pivot point down. And we'll move the object up like this. Perhaps I'll do a quick scale to this. But something like this. Let me freeze the transforms while I'm at it. And I'll call this backdrop. Now, I haven't really done anything with materials in this scene. For the time being, I'm going to just create a very simple Lambert material. And for the sake of really looking at lights, I'm going to go ahead and just make this white, and we'll make both the teddy bear and the backdrop, for the time being, use this very simple shader. So why did I make this backdrop as I did? Well, so that it wouldn't have any hard angles on it. It doesn't have any hard angle here. So it'll just make for a very nice backdrop for some very simple renders. Let's go ahead and start creating a light in our scene. So I might need to, depending on the position that I choose for this, I might need to rearrange the backdrop a little bit. But let's go ahead and create a light here. I'm going to go to Create, Lights, and we'll make a spotlight. And in fact, while I'm at it, I'm going to go ahead and name this light. We'll call it Key Light. And to position it, it's very simple. The simplest way is to treat it as if it were a camera. Obviously, we can, in any of these viewports, turn on lights, and we can move the light. But the simplest way to work with these lights is to look through it. And for that, I think I'm going to use this viewport here that is currently the front viewport. And I'll simply go to Panels, Look Through Selected. And now we're looking through the light as if it were a camera, which makes it very easy to position. I'm going to position it somewhat to the character's right and looking from above, something like this perhaps. Something that we can do that'll help us set up our lights is to activate the shadows. And remember, to do that in your viewport, you can simply go to Lighting, Shadows, and then this will really help you place your light so that you can work with the shadows as part of an element of your composition, let's say. So with the shadow activated like that, I'll go ahead and just start placing my light in a manner more like what I want so that the shadow is on the surface in an interesting way, maybe something like this. Now remember that even though you've activated shadows in your viewport, if you're using the Maya software render here, then when you render, you're actually not going to see any shadows. You'll notice that there is no shadow currently being cast right now. I'm going to go ahead and keep this image. With my light still selected, what I'm going to do is come over here to the depth map shadow attribute, and I'll check Use Depth Map Shadows. Now, if we render this out, we have our cast shadow in our render. Now, you'll notice that the shadow looks a bit pixelated, both here and here on our mesh. And to fix that, we can change some of the properties of the light itself, the resolution as well as the filter size. Filter size will soften the shadow. So if I change this from 1 to, let's say, 3, that should blur this a little bit more and make the shadow look more acceptable. As you can see, that's exactly what it did. But another way also that we can maybe fix the shadow, I'm going to set that back to 1, is change the resolution so that it is a greater resolution. Currently it's set to 512. Let's try doubling that and making it 1024 and see what that gives us. Looks a little bit better. However, you can see it's still a little pixelated. Perhaps if we do a combination of upping the resolution of the shadow as well as adjusting that filter size to get something like this. Another thing to remember about the lights, of course, is that you can adjust the intensity, either bringing it down or bringing it up. And we can also change the color of our light. It can be any color we wish it to be. I'm going to make this light a warm color. I don't want it quite that yellow, however, so I'll go ahead and just desaturate it and perhaps go with something like this. Maybe a little bit less, actually. You can be quite subtle oftentimes with these. But that will make it a nice warm light. Now, if we're using something like the Arnold render, which is a much more robust render than the Maya software render, we would actually be calculating the bounced light. We'd have light bouncing off of various surfaces in a more realistic manner. We don't get that with Maya software, which is why we have these very hard shadows and this very hard shading here on this object. But there are some techniques that we can do to simulate or fake the idea of bounced light. And one of those things that we can do is by creating what is called an ambient light. So I'm going to go to Create, Lights, Ambient Light. Now this brightened it up a little too much. We'll go ahead and just decrease that light. We'll make it, in fact, much weaker. And try rendering that out and see how it looks. We can play around with these values a little bit. And perhaps I'll go with something like this. As you can see, what this is doing is making these areas that are in shade, they're shaded, not be entirely dark, not be entirely in shadow. Now I'm going to name this ambient light. We'll name it fill light, indicating that we're using it to fill these areas here. We could actually do this with another spotlight and simply place it to the right of this model. That would be more like a actual fill light, or it might be like in a photography studio where there could be a wall over here and the light that's being cast from this direction is bouncing off of that light and then helping fill in those shadows there. We might end up doing that a little later, but for the time being we'll go ahead and stick with this ambient light as our fill light, and what we'll do is create a third light now, and for this light we'll create another spotlight. So I'll go to Create, Lights, Spotlight, and I'm going to once again come over to one of my viewports. I think I'll choose this one, look through the light, and we'll place it. I'm going to place it behind the character, or mesh, and I'll just start kind of gently placing it around like this maybe. So you understand what I'm trying to do here. It's basically just to get some of these areas to have some strong light as kind of an outline. And in fact, we'll call this light our rim light. Now, when we render this out, one thing you'll notice is that with those two spotlights in our scene, we're really kind of losing this nice shadow that we had, and then we're also getting this outline from our rim light that I really don't like to have. So this is where we can fake some things in Maya that maybe you can't exactly do in the real world. What I'm going to do is open up what is called the relationship editor, and we can find that here under Windows, Relationship Editors, and we're going to open up specifically the light linking one, and you can choose either light centric or object centric. I just chose light centric here. We should be able to find my light here. Let me open that up again. I'm object centric. I actually clicked on object centric instead of light centric by accident. Looks like we can change that here. It doesn't really matter though. You can work both ways. Here is my spotlight. I'm surprised that it's not showing the name that I named it earlier. Not quite sure why it's not showing the name here, but what you will see here is that if I select the light in this column, I can tell it to not affect certain objects in my scene. So my spotlight 1, I want it to affect both the teddy bear and the backdrop, but my spotlight 2, I'm going to turn off the backdrop for it. Now we didn't see any change here, but if I render it out, you'll notice that now we get that nice shadow and that rim light of ours is not affecting the, the backdrop that we've placed here. And actually, I just realized what the problem was with the naming of my lights here, and I'll show you what that is. I'm going to open up the outliner, and you'll notice that, in fact, I haven't renamed my lights. I renamed their shape nodes instead. So I'm just going to come in here and quickly rename these. Actually, yeah, we'll just quickly rename these. I'm going to name them in the channel box. So we'll call this key light. It might not let me change it to that name. It did. Okay. I thought we might have a problem with that. We'll call this our fill light. And we'll call this one our rim light. Now, currently, if we select my different lights in here and open up their attribute editor, you'll notice that I have them actually, well, for the most part, all the same color. I did change the key light to a nice warm color. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the rim light and make it into a colder color, something more in, let's say, the blues. And in fact, I'm going to increase the intensity of it as well. And let's render that out and see how that looks. And as you can see, that can be kind of a nice effect here to get that stronger rim light with maybe a cooler color and a lighter color with our key light. So I spent just a few more moments just adjusting some of the lights and the materials to make the background different color than the teddy bear mesh here. And here is my render. As you can see, this backdrop here, it's nice in that it doesn't have any hard angles in here. Allows us to focus on the model. It's a very simple background, but it can be a very effective background for showing off your models. And that's a little bit about lighting. Now, before wrapping up this video, I'd like to just discuss one more thing regarding lights that I think is interesting. And that's how in the 3D software, it simulates a lot of the actual properties of lights in the real world. So in this scene, I have 3 lights. You'll see that I have 3 spotlights here. And if we select these different lights and look at them in the attribute editor, you'll notice that I have a green light, a blue light, and a red light. In other words, RGB. And what I'd like you to take note of is how these lights actually behave like real lights. In other words, if I were to select this green light here and turn down its intensity, you'll see how the blue and the red light interact to create this magenta color. Or we can select this light here. Let's see which one that is. That's our blue light there. And if we bring its intensity down, you'll see how the green and the red light combine to create yellow. And finally, if we select our red light and we bring it down, you see how the green and the blue light create cyan. Or if we have them all on, you'll see how the three lights, where they all interact together, where they all overlap together, we get white, just as you would with actual lights in the real world. So that's what I got for you for this video here. And what I recommend is use lights to effectively create appealing images for your renders. Thank you for watching.